Is the gospel teaching people how to suffer and like it? Because the more we look at the text objectively, without presupposition, the blessings of God seem to always require the bondage of humanity. At the outset of his public ministry, Jesus ascended a hillside and spoke words that have echoed through millennia, popularly referred to as the Beatitudes. For countless believers, these 9 blessings promise comfort, justice, and divine favor to the broken, the mourning, and the meek. They are routinely celebrated as the revolutionary heart of the gospel, a countercultural manifesto of hope for the poor and oppressed. Yet, swept up in centuries of devotional repetition, we rarely pause to ask how these declarations actually function in the lives of their recipients. Far from catalyzing social transformation, the Beatitudes operate as a sophisticated mechanisms of psychological subversion and social control. Each blessing valorizes a state of deficiency, poverty of spirit, mourning, or meekness, only to defer true power to an indeterminate future or heavenly realm. In practice, they condition individuals towards self-negation, passive endurance, and institutional dependency, effectively blinding communities to both their capacity for change and their responsibility to make a difference here and now. Today, we're going to unpack a few of these blessings to get a better view. We'll start with verse 3. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, Jesus opens up his sermonic interlude with these words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, on the surface, Jesus pronounces a blessing on those who recognize their own spiritual poverty or insufficiency. On one hand, humility can be noble, but here the text elevates poverty, a deficit, into the doorway for the true kingdom of God. That flips the usual script. Rather than rewarding strength or flourishing, it valorizes neediness. Let's talk about how that seeds social control. This internalizes despair. If your default state is poor in spirit, you're encouraged to accept misery as a part of divine order. Instead of challenging the systems that leave people impoverished, economic injustice, political disenfranchisement, the remedy becomes personal humility or prayer. The promise, theirs is the kingdom, hangs like a carrot. Endure your deprivation now, and one day you'll get your reward. That delay keeps people compliant. Biblical humility isn't just modesty. It's a structural self-negation. These scriptures don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within the context of a gospel, of a doctrine, and of sermons, often coupled with other scriptures such as God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble, or scriptures that turn pride into the ultimate sin and humility into the only virtue worth seeking. There are other scriptures like the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit, and a contrite and broken heart he will not despise. These scriptures normalize brokenness as the default human condition. Even Paul says, "For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing." This drives home that every self-effort is tainted. Only institutional mediation, the church, the sacraments, or the clergy can bridge the gap. Together, they set up a dynamic where self-loathing breeds dependency. If your natural state is broken, then you need an external authority to heal or absolve you. Deferred reward enforces patience. Heaven's promise just out of reach keeps people from demanding justice or change now. And then it turns guilt into governance. Regular confession, penance, or self-denial rituals constantly remind you of your unworthiness and, by extension, your obligation to obey. So, of course, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, because they're the only ones broken enough to fall for it. When you take poor in spirit from a noble sounding aphorism to an internalized identity, it reshapes how you think, feel, and act in profound, often debilitating ways. Let's talk about 3 ways that this seeps into individual behavior and undermines human agency. Number 1, there's the issue with cognitive reprogramming, from self-worth to self-negation. If your natural state is spiritually bankrupt, you're habitually scanning for evidence of moral failure. Every misstep, from a harsh word to an uncharitable thought, becomes proof that you're not good. You stop trusting your own judgment and you start looking for external absolution. Clergy, advice, ritual acts, doctrinal assurances to decide whether you're okay. You can even notice this phenomenon in my comments sometimes when people ask this telltale question, who should I believe now? This is a red flag that this person has completely given up on their capacity to know and to understand. Repeated messages that self-effort is tainted, like in me dwells no good thing. This trains you to believe that nothing you do really matters, so why even try? Number two, there's also behavioral consequences, and we're talking submission, passivity, and compliance. If agency is suspect, I can't trust my own self, my own spirit, my own mind, my own body, you're less likely to take risks, innovate, or challenge the status quo. It's better to wait for permission than to act on your own. You begin to replace genuine moral decision-making with formulaic rituals like prayer, fasting, and tithing as the primary way to be good. Action becomes checkbox compliance instead of heartfelt conviction. And then any impulse to raise your voice or question doctrine or even critique leadership or demand justice gets smothered by the conviction, who am I to speak? And number three, agency gets eroded as your dependency on institutional mediation increases. Because you believe you're fundamentally broken, you turn to priests, pastors, or elders to arbitrate every personal or moral crisis. Your autonomy cedes ground to their authority. The promise of theirs is the kingdom of heaven shifts empowerment into the indefinite future or afterlife. Earthly life becomes a holding pattern, a waiting room, obedience now, reward later. In a congregation where everyone bears the same poverty, peer pressure enforces conformity. You police yourself by watching others, and others police you by watching you. When poverty of self is preached as the gold standard of spirituality, it doesn't just shape pious interiority, it disciplines societies. Individuals who doubt their own worth become less likely to agitate for systemic change, less likely to trust their own moral compass, and more likely to live in the fear of stepping out of line. All right, let's look at the next verse. In verse 4, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." On the surface, Jesus pronounced blessing on those who experience deep sorrow, whether for personal loss, suffering in the world, or even grief over their own failings. The promise is that comfort awaits them. When? Who knows? The major issue here is that this elevates suffering. Grief then becomes a badge of honor. Rather than alleviating sorrow, the text valorizes it. The comfort isn't guaranteed immediately or necessarily on earth. The promise of consolation often lies in some future or otherworldly realm. This shifts mourning into a moral imperative. If you're not mourning, are you missing out on the blessing? That pressure can make even healthy sadness feel insufficient. You feel like you got to ratchet up your guilt to qualify. All right, let's unpack the seeds of control in this one. First, there's the normalization of pain. By teaching that mourning is the pathway to blessing, the text channels resistance to suffering into piety. Instead of asking, why does injustice persist, the mourner internalizes the sorrow. This also gives leverage to institutional comfort. Who provides the promised comfort? The community, the clergy, the sacraments. That creates dependency. You lean into the grief, then lean on the institution for relief. This also pacifies activism. If your call is simply to mourn rather than to protest or rebuild, then you'll spend energy in quiet lament rather than collective action. Mourning then becomes a safety valve, releasing social outrage into tears instead of movement. There's also an issue of emotional regulation. Ritualized confession of pain, mourning services, or lamentation liturgies channel grief into structured forms that the institution controls. Times, places, and even acceptable topics. Valorizing grief becomes a tool of social control. How, you may ask? Well, by weaponizing endurance. Framing deep sorrow as blessed sanctifies pain itself. Believers learn that the correct response to injustice isn't protest or redress, but dutiful endurance. This is my cross to bear. By promising comfort only in the future or in some other realm, institutions keep people locked into a holding pattern of obedience, withholding any real-world relief. This cultivates resignation. When grief is elevated to a spiritual ideal, systemic wrongs such as poverty, oppression, or abuse get absorbed into personal tragedy rather than exposed as social failures demanding action. Ritualized mourning services and liturgies channel genuine outrage into rote repetition, replaying loss without ever challenging the structures that caused it. And this is supported by our dependency on the institutional ritual-controlled outlets. Churches offer mourning services, groups, or scripted prayers, which are safe spaces where grief is witnessed but contained under clerical oversight. This lets institutions appear compassionate while diffusing any spark of collective resistance. If everyone's expected to grieve in the right way, then deviation, such as anger, protest, or satire, marks you as unrighteous. Social pressure polices emotional boundaries and keeps dissenting feelings privatized. And this is how we get to the pacification of collective action, because grief becomes a safety valve. Mass or collective sorrow events release communal tension through tears, hymns, or confession, then everyone goes home, empties out, less likely to organize or rebel. This is neutralizing outrage by ritualizing. By ritualizing mourning, outrage becomes a sacrament. We're all sinners here, not a call to political or social transformation. Let's unpack this a little further. This so-called blessing is a prime example of cognitive reprogramming, turning grief into an identity, creating moral calibration by suffering. Sorrow becomes the primary test of authenticity. If you aren't broken, you aren't blessed. Every setback or injustice is reframed not as an external wrong to fix, but as evidence you're living out the true Christian life. By praising grief, the text trains you to expect pain as your default state. Joy or contentment can even begin to feel like spiritual failure. This expectation shapes your inner dialogue. If I'm not grieving, am I missing out on the blessing? Meaning resides then in the emotion itself rather than in any external reality or action. That undercuts the idea that life circumstances can or should improve. You're meant to find purpose in the pain. And there are behavioral consequences with this one to consider as well. Instead of mobilizing against injustice, believers are taught that steadfast sorrow is the noblest response. Protest is recast as pride. Acceptance becomes the true witness. Public grief rituals become shows of piety, intense, but ultimately scripted. Participants learn the approved way to mourn, weeping, hymns, prayers, and then go home. Any sign of anger or satire is immediately branded ungodly. Liturgies and sermons that dwell on sin and suffering keep congregants cycling through the same grief narratives instead of moving toward resolution. It's a trauma trap. And all of this contributes to the erosion of agency and increased dependency and deferral. Religious institutions then become the gatekeepers of comfort, because you shall be comforted only when the institution deems that you're ready, through sanctioned rituals, clergy approval, or doctrinal compliance. Real-world relief, such as counseling, legal assistance, or advocacy, is often deferred in favor of spiritual consolation. A grieving community enforces uniform sorrow. If you express righteous anger at, say, economic exploitation, you're castigated for lacking faith. Dissenting emotions are silenced as signs of spiritual arrogance. Mourning for the world becomes the highest form of solidarity, so actual organizing, protest, or policy demands get replaced by intercessory prayer. Are you ready for one more? Let's do verse 5. Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." On a surface level, Jesus is pronouncing blessings on the meek, often rendered as gentle or humble, promising them ultimate possession of the earth. Is anybody noticing a theme yet? With a closer look, we see that this is an elevation of submission. Praising meekness reframes what most cultures see as a weakness, subordination to others, as a path to divine reward. The promise, inheriting the earth, hinges on a future vindication, not present agency. It begs the question, inherit from who, when, how, and why? By labeling assertiveness as unmeek and thus unblessed, the text can be used to shame resistance. Let's deal with some of the cognitive reprogramming. Believers learn to equate spiritual virtue with accepting injustice silently, rewriting power dynamics. True authority is taught to belong only to those who relinquish all claims to earthly power. Ambitious thoughts such as defending my rights are then recast as some type of pride or arrogance. So in workplaces or families, challenging unfair treatment feels spiritually suspect. Turning the other cheek becomes the default response to abuse or exploitation. So then potential change agents hold back, wary of being labeled arrogant or unmeek. I lived there for years. And let's also highlight how this erodes our agency. Earthly rights are surrendered in hope of a heavenly inheritance. So legal or collective action is foregone. Church authorities interpret when and how inheriting the earth applies, keeping power centralized. And then congregants themselves enforce meek norms by stigmatizing anyone who pushes back. European missionaries in the Americas taught indigenous peoples that meek submission to both God and colonizers was virtuous. That theology pacified resistance to land seizures and labor exploitation, framing colonial rule as the divinely sanctioned inheritance for the meek. The result is a coerced social order where protest was branded prideful and submission became the blessing. So let's unpack the hidden machinery. Each beatitude carries a promise. Theirs is the kingdom, they shall be comforted, they shall inherit the earth. That sounds liberating on the surface to the uncritical mind. But as we've seen, those same promises enforce a psychology of brokenness, grief, and meekness, turning inner turmoil into a spiritual virtue. The result is not freedom, but a learned passivity. The believer's mind is conditioned to accept suffering as sacred and obedience as the only rightful response. And please consider the implications of such. If I believe it is my natural default state to suffer, then what do I believe about the suffering of others? It's paradoxical that we lionize Jesus as the ultimate revolutionary, even while his own teachings normalize subjugation. Over millennia, ruling authorities from imperial Rome to feudal lords to modern religious and governmental hierarchies have seized on these words to pacify dissent. What was once framed as radical rhetoric of personal transformation has now been clearly demonstrated to be an instruction manual for compliance. For 2,000 years, the downtrodden have clung to these promises, seeing in them a flicker of hope amid tyranny. Yet that same language that was said to inspire endurance instead stunted collective action. Generations raised on the rhythm of blessed are they who mourn found their tears sanctified, but their outrage diffused. The rhetoric of blessing became the velvet glove that concealed the iron fist of control. Far from a blueprint for social reform, the Beatitudes map out an inner journey away from worldly engagement. At best, they divert attention into pious reflection. At worst, they shepherd entire populations into docile acceptance of injustice. The promise of future reward outweighs any incentive to challenge present wrongs, turning outrage into obeisance. When these teachings take root, they recast agency as arrogance and curiosity as cursed. Entire communities, comforted in their passive faith, opt for ignorance as bliss, unaware of their power to reshape society. Responsibility is then outsourced to divine promise, and capacity for change is willingly surrendered to institutional interpreters. In the end, the very words we hail as blessed become the chains that bind. If you enjoyed today's conversation, let me know where you're watching from down below in the comments. You may be surprised to find that there are others in your city or state who are tuning in as well. For many, deconstruction is just the first step in figuring out what's next, and that's not an easy process, but community helps. For online fan space, join our Discord and connect with others across the globe who are attracted to conversations just like these. For more focused conversations on building and being a part of a community, enroll in our free BC 101 How We Change the World course and start connecting and conversing with other members of Bridge City Global. And if you're really about that life and you want to be a part of local meetups and events in your city, head over to our BC Weekends website and tap in. Let us know that you're interested so that as qualified interest builds in your city, we can make plans. But I need your help. I need you to sign up so that I know that there is interest in your area, and I need you to encourage others to do the same. We have a lot of supporters in Southern California right now, so if you're in Cali, there's already a head start. Make sure your name is on the list. And last but definitely not least, are you in the Nashville, Tennessee area? I will be at the Nashville Nuns Convention from July 25th through July 27th, and I would absolutely love to meet some of you in person. If there's enough interest, I'd be willing to organize a separate meetup for us as well. I'll also be driving through Montgomery, Birmingham, and possibly Atlanta on the way back, so opportunities abound. If you're interested in connecting while I'm traveling, join my Patreon and let's talk. All the links are in the description. I appreciate you all sincerely. Until next time, keep rising.